"Sir, parents are not allowed through this gate," the security officer said sharply, his voice loud enough that several parents nearby turned their heads. For a brief moment, the busy morning outside Oak Ridge Academy slowed down, as if the entire front entrance had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe. The man standing at the gate did not argue. Marcus Bennett simply stood there holding a small white bakery box in one hand, his other hand resting loosely at his side. Had insisted that his father come, even though Marcus had gently warned him that he might not look like the other parents arriving in polished cars and tailored suits. Tyler had only smiled and said something that still echoed in Marcus's mind as he stood at the gate. "Dad, they're going to love you." The memory softened Marcus's expression for a brief second. Across the playground, he finally spotted Tyler near the basketball court, laughing with two classmates while holding a bright blue science folder against his chest. The boy had his father's eyes and the same quiet confidence that seemed to live somewhere deep beneath the surface. Marcus raised his hand slightly, though the distance was too far for Tyler to notice. At that moment, the heavy front doors of Oak Ridge Academy opened again, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped outside, scanning the front entrance with practiced authority. The security officer straightened immediately. "Good morning, Principal Whitmore," he said. The principal nodded as he approached the gate. Then his eyes moved to the man being stopped. For a second, he simply stared, as if a memory was slowly rising from somewhere deep in his mind. Marcus Bennett stood calmly on the other side of the iron gate, still holding the small white box of cinnamon rolls, unaware that the next words spoken at that entrance would change the entire morning. Principal Daniel Whitmore slowed his steps as he approached the iron gate, his polished shoes clicking softly against the stone walkway. The security officer straightened his posture immediately, sensing the shift in authority. The quiet murmur among the parents grew softer, replaced by that strange silence that often appears when people feel that something unusual is about to happen. Marcus Bennett remained standing exactly where he had been, one hand holding the small white bakery box, his eyes calm, patient, almost thoughtful. From across the playground, the laughter of children continued, bright and carefree, untouched by the tension forming at the entrance. Principal Whitmore stopped a few feet away from the gate and looked carefully at Marcus. His brow tightened slightly, as if he were searching through a memory that refused to come quickly. The security officer cleared his throat and spoke with confidence, eager to explain. "This man tried to enter through the gate during school hours. I told him that parents cannot come. Inside right now. He says he is here for one of the students." Crossed his face. The security officer glanced between the two men, confused by the sudden pause. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked. "Not forget the cinnamon rolls. Everyone is going to try them." Marcus had laughed then and promised he would bring them himself. Now that promise stood quietly in his hand while the world around him hesitated. Principal Whitmore drew in a slow breath. The expression on his face had shifted again, no longer confused, but deeply focused, as if an old memory had finally found its place. He looked down briefly, then back up at Marcus with renewed attention. "Mr. Bennett," he said slowly, almost testing the words. Marcus answered with calm respect. "Yes, sir." The security officer glanced between the two men, sensing that something had changed but not understanding what. Held Marcus Bennett's gaze for another quiet moment while the realization settled fully into place. The faint sounds of children talking across the playground continued, but near the iron gate the air had grown unusually still. The security officer stood waiting for instruction, his posture firm, but his expression beginning to show uncertainty. A few parents nearby had now turned their attention completely toward the entrance, sensing that something important was unfolding. Whitmore finally straightened his shoulders and spoke with calm clarity. "Officer Grant, you will not need to call the office." The security officer blinked in surprise. "Sir." Whitmore turned slightly toward him, though his eyes returned quickly to Marcus. "Mr. Bennett is not just here for Parent Presentation Day. In fact, he is exactly the person we have been expecting this morning." The officer frowned, trying to understand. Expecting. Marcus remained quiet, the small bakery box still balanced carefully in his hand. Whitmore continued speaking, his voice measured and respectful now. The Oak Ridge Academy faculty has been preparing for today's guest presentation for several weeks. We invited a visiting scholar to speak about educational opportunity and institutional bias. The principal paused briefly, allowing the words to settle in the air. A few parents nearby leaned closer without realizing they were doing so. Whitmore then looked directly at Marcus Bennett again and spoke the words that would quietly shift the entire moment. Professor Bennett, we are honored that you accepted our invitation. For a heartbeat, the world around the gate seemed to stop moving. The security officer's arms slowly lowered from his chest as confusion spread across his face. The parents who had been whispering fell silent. Marcus Bennett inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the greeting with calm humility. "Thank you, Principal Whitmore," he replied gently. "I was glad to come. My son was especially excited about today." The security officer looked from Marcus to the principal and back again, clearly trying to reconcile the man he had stopped only moments earlier with the title he had just heard. "Professor." Whitmore turned toward him with patient professionalism. "Officer Grant, this is Professor Marcus Bennett from the National Center for Educational Equity. His research on access and fairness in American schools has influenced policy discussions across the country." The officer's mouth opened slightly before he quickly closed it again. His confident certainty from earlier had faded, replaced by the uneasy realization that the man he had treated like an unwelcome stranger was in fact the guest speaker the school had been waiting for. Across the playground, Tyler Bennett watched the scene unfold with growing excitement. He could not hear every word, but he recognized the shift in the adult's posture. When the gate finally opened with a soft metallic click, Tyler's face lit up with pride. Marcus stepped forward through the entrance with the same calm composure he had carried from the beginning. He did not move quickly or dramatically. Instead, he walked with the steady pace of a man who had learned that dignity does not require performance. As he passed Officer Grant, he paused briefly and offered a polite nod. "Good morning, officer." The simple courtesy only deepened the guard's embarrassment. Whitmore gestured toward the school building. "Professor Bennett, your session with the students begins shortly. The faculty lounge has prepared a space for you to set down your materials." Marcus lifted the small white bakery box slightly. "I should probably deliver these first. Tyler promised his class that I would bring cinnamon rolls for everyone." Whitmore smiled faintly, a hint of warmth breaking through the formal moment. "I suspect that will make you very popular with the students." Tyler had already begun running across the playground, his backpack bouncing lightly against his shoulders. "Dad," he called out joyfully as he reached the walkway. Marcus knelt down slightly as the boy reached him, placing one arm around his son's shoulders. "Did you make it on time?" Tyler asked eagerly. Marcus smiled. "I did." Tyler looked up proudly at the principal standing nearby. "This is my dad," he said. Whitmore nodded respectfully. "Yes, Tyler. We know exactly who your father is." And around them, the parents who had watched the earlier exchange began to understand that the man they had quietly judged only minutes before was not simply a father waiting outside the gate. He was a voice that had spent years teaching schools across the nation how easily dignity could be overlooked. Tyler Bennett walked beside his father along the stone path that led from the iron gate toward the main entrance of Oak Ridge Academy, his small steps almost bouncing with excitement. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting warm light across the wide playground and the tall brick walls of the school building. Students moved through the courtyard in clusters, some carrying science projects, others laughing as they hurried toward their classrooms before the bell. Yet many of them slowed when they noticed the quiet procession forming around Marcus Bennett. Principal Daniel Whitmore walked slightly ahead, holding the front door open with a respectful gesture that did not go unnoticed by the nearby parents who had watched the earlier scene at the gate. Marcus stepped inside the building beside his son, the familiar scent of polished floors and old books filling the hallway. The walls of Oak Ridge Academy were lined with framed photographs of past graduating classes, academic awards, and banners celebrating national competitions. Tyler pointed eagerly down the corridor. "Our classroom is right this way, Dad. Mr. Harper said today is going to be the best presentation day we have ever had." Marcus smiled at the enthusiasm in his son's voice. I hope the cinnamon rolls help with that. Tyler laughed quietly and held the classroom door open while his father carried the white bakery box inside. The room was bright with morning sunlight pouring through tall windows that overlooked the playground. Small desks were arranged in a semicircle around a presentation area where a chalkboard displayed the words Parent Presentation Day written carefully in blue chalk. Several children were already seated, whispering to one another with curiosity as Marcus entered the room. Mr. Harper stood near the teacher's desk, organizing a stack of student reports. When he saw Marcus Bennett step inside the classroom, he paused for a brief moment, then smiled warmly and walked forward to greet him. Professor Bennett, welcome to Oak Ridge Academy. It is a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Marcus offered a friendly handshake. Thank you for inviting me. Tyler has been looking forward to this day all week. The teacher nodded with amusement as he glanced toward Tyler, who was now proudly standing beside his desk with his backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder. I can believe that. Tyler has mentioned your visit more than once during class discussions. A few of the students nearby had begun whispering again. One girl leaned toward her friend and asked quietly, "Did he say professor?" Another boy looked at Marcus with wide curiosity, as if trying to imagine how Tyler's father could be the special guest they had been hearing about. Marcus carefully placed the bakery box on the teacher's desk and opened the lid. The warm scent of cinnamon and sugar drifted across the classroom instantly. Tyler clapped his hands softly with excitement. I told everyone they would be amazing. Mr. Harper laughed lightly. I think you may have already won the class over before the presentation even begins. Outside the classroom door, Principal Whitmore stood watching the moment for a second longer. His expression had softened with thoughtful reflection. Only a short time earlier the man, now standing comfortably among the students, had been waiting outside the iron gate, while others questioned whether he belonged there at all. Whitmore quietly stepped away from the doorway and continued down the hallway, his mind still returning to the lecture he had heard years ago at the university conference. The memory of Marcus Bennett speaking about assumptions and fairness had remained with him ever since that day. Inside the classroom, Tyler had already begun introducing his father to his classmates with the simple pride only a child could carry. This is my dad, he told them. He studies how schools can be fair to every student. Marcus listened to his son's words and smiled gently. The children leaned forward with growing curiosity, unaware that the lesson they were about to hear had already begun long before Marcus Bennett stepped into their classroom that morning. The classroom slowly settled into a quiet circle of attention as the students gathered around their desks, the warm scent of cinnamon rolls still floating gently through the air. Tyler Bennett stood beside his father with unmistakable pride, his eyes bright with the excitement of introducing someone he admired. Mr. Harper clapped his hands softly to bring the room to order, though the children were already leaning forward with curiosity. All right, class, today we have a very special guest, he said warmly. Many of you have brought parents to speak about their jobs today, but Tyler's father studies something that affects every school in the country. Marcus Bennett stepped forward near the chalkboard, his calm presence filling the room without any need for dramatic gestures. The sunlight from the tall windows rested across the wooden floor, and outside the faint sound of recess bells from another grade echoed across the campus. Marcus looked around at the small faces watching him with interest. Thank you for welcoming me into your classroom today, he began gently. I spend my time studying how schools can make sure every student feels respected and included, no matter where they come from. A boy near the front row raised his hand quickly. Does that mean you tell teachers what to do? A few students giggled softly. Marcus smiled kindly. Not exactly. I try to help schools understand how people sometimes make decisions before they really know someone. The children listened closely, though they were still young enough to view the world in simple terms. Tyler watched his father with quiet admiration. He had heard parts of these ideas before during late evening conversations at their small kitchen table, when Marcus prepared notes for his research or upcoming lectures. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook. Inside were a few sketches and simple diagrams he often used when explaining difficult ideas in ways that children could understand. He drew a small circle on the chalkboard and then several smaller circles around it. "Imagine a school like a community," he said calmly. "Every student inside that community deserves to feel like they belong in the center, not outside the circle." A girl near the window raised her hand. "What happens if someone thinks you do not belong?" Marcus paused for a moment before answering. "That is a very thoughtful question. Sometimes people make assumptions based on what they see first. Your clothes, your voice, your background. They might decide something about you before they even learn your name." The classroom grew quieter as the students considered this idea. Tyler glanced briefly toward the hallway outside the classroom door, remembering the moment earlier that morning when his father had been standing at the gate. He understood more than his classmates what that lesson truly meant. Marcus continued speaking in a calm, patient voice that carried easily across the room. "But real understanding begins when we slow down and learn who someone truly is. Schools are places where that learning should happen every day." Mr. Harper nodded quietly as he listened from the side of the room. The message Marcus Bennett shared was simple enough for the children to understand, yet powerful enough to reach far beyond the classroom walls. After a few more minutes, Marcus closed his notebook and leaned lightly against the teacher's desk. "Now I have a question for all of you," he said with a gentle smile. "If you saw someone new standing outside your school gate this morning, what is the first thing you might think about them?" The children exchanged thoughtful looks, unsure how to answer. Tyler slowly raised his hand. "Maybe we should ask their name first." Marcus smiled proudly at his son. That is exactly where understanding begins. And in the quiet warmth of that classroom, the lesson that had started outside the iron gate continued to unfold, one thoughtful question at a time. The classroom remained quiet for a moment after Tyler spoke, his simple answer lingering gently in the air. Marcus Bennett looked around at the students seated in the semicircle, their small faces thoughtful as they tried to understand the meaning behind the discussion. Outside the tall windows, the late morning sunlight rested across the playground, and the distant sound of another class moving through the hallway echoed faintly beyond the door. Marcus nodded slowly at his son before turning his attention back to the group. "Asking someone their name first is a powerful beginning," he said calmly. "When we learn a name, we start to see the person instead of just the outside." The children listened closely. Even the ones who had been quietly nibbling on cinnamon rolls now seemed drawn into the conversation. A boy near the back of the room raised his hand carefully. "My dad says you can usually tell what someone is like just by looking at them." Marcus walked a few steps closer, keeping his voice warm and respectful. "Many people believe that," he replied gently. "Sometimes our minds try to understand the world quickly, but quick answers are not always correct answers." The boy considered that thought while several classmates nodded slowly. Mr. Harper watched the exchange with quiet appreciation, recognizing how naturally Marcus was guiding the children into deeper thinking without ever speaking down to them. Marcus picked up a piece of chalk and drew another circle beside the first one on the board. "Let me tell you a small story," he said. "Early this morning, I was standing outside the front gate of this school. Several students glanced toward the hallway as if they might somehow see the gate from where they sat." Marcus continued calmly. "A person there did not recognize me, so he had to decide what to do based only on what he could see. My clothes were simple. I was carrying a box of cinnamon rolls. From the outside, I looked like any ordinary parent waiting at the entrance." The children listened with growing curiosity, unaware that the situation he described had happened only a short time earlier. Tyler lowered his eyes for a moment, remembering the moment he had seen his father standing outside the gate. Marcus placed the chalk back on the tray and folded his hands lightly in front of him. "When someone sees you for the first time," he explained, "they might notice only a few small details. Maybe the color of your jacket, maybe the way you speak, maybe where they think you belong. But those details are only the surface of a much larger story." A girl sitting near the front row tilted her head thoughtfully. "So if you do not know someone yet, you should wait before deciding who they are." Marcus smiled softly. "Exactly. Real understanding begins when we take the time to listen before we judge." Tyler raised his hand again, this time with a quiet confidence in his voice. "That is why you study schools, right, Dad?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, because schools are places where every student deserves to feel welcome the moment they walk through the door." Mr. Harper stepped forward slightly, resting his hand on the edge of the teacher's desk. "And sometimes the best lessons are the ones that happen before class even begins," he added thoughtfully. The students exchanged curious looks, sensing that the story Marcus had shared might hold more meaning than they fully understood yet. Outside the classroom door, a few teachers walking down the hallway paused briefly when they heard the calm voice speaking inside. Word had already begun to spread quietly through the building that the visiting scholar presenting to the students that morning was not only a respected professor, but also the father of one of their own classmates. Inside the classroom, Marcus looked again at the circle of young faces. "You will all meet many people in your lives," he said gently. "Some of them will look different from what you expect. Some may speak differently. Some may arrive in ways that surprise you. But every one of them carries a story worth hearing." The children sat quietly, absorbing the message in a way only young minds can when they are guided with patience rather than instruction. And though none of them fully realized it yet, the lesson that had begun outside the iron gate was slowly becoming a story they would remember long after that school day ended. The classroom remained quietly focused after Marcus Bennett finished speaking, the students still absorbing the idea that every person carries a story beyond what can be seen at first glance. Sunlight continued to spill through the tall windows, creating warm squares of light across the wooden floor where a few cinnamon crumbs from the morning treats had fallen. The calm rhythm of the school day moved gently around them. Yet inside that room, the conversation had taken on a deeper meaning than the children had expected when the morning began. Marcus looked around the semicircle of desks and noticed the thoughtful expressions forming across the young faces. Curiosity had replaced the earlier excitement about pastries and presentations. A boy seated near the window slowly raised his hand again. "When you were outside the gate this morning, did the person there know you were Professor?" Marcus shook his head softly. "No." At that moment, he only saw a father standing at the entrance. The boy leaned forward slightly. "Did they make you feel upset?" Marcus paused for a brief moment before answering. His voice remained steady and gentle. "Not upset, but it reminded me how quickly people can misunderstand one another." The classroom grew very quiet again. Tyler Bennett watched his father carefully, his small hands resting on the edge of his desk. He had always known that his father studied schools and fairness, but hearing the lesson explained in front of his classmates made the moment feel more personal than ever. Marcus walked slowly toward the chalkboard again and picked up the piece of white chalk. "Sometimes life gives us examples of the lessons we study," he continued calmly. This morning was one of those examples. He drew a simple line between the two circles he had drawn earlier on the board. One circle represented assumptions. The other represented understanding. Between them, he wrote a single word in clear letters. "Listening." The children leaned forward to read the word. "Listening helps us move from assumptions to understanding," Marcus explained. "When we take the time to listen, we learn something new about the person standing in front of us." Mr. Harper folded his arms thoughtfully while watching the students process the idea. A girl sitting near Tyler slowly raised her hand. "My grandmother says that kindness is also a way of listening." Marcus smiled warmly at her observation. "Your grandmother sounds very wise." Kindness often begins when we remember that everyone has a story we cannot see right away. Tyler looked around at his classmates, then raised his hand once more. "If someone makes a mistake about you, what should you do?" Marcus looked directly at his son for a moment before answering. His voice softened slightly. "Sometimes the best response is patience. When people learn more about you, their understanding can change." Across the room, a few students nodded quietly, sensing that the lesson applied not only to adults, but to the small moments they experienced every day in hallways and playgrounds. Outside the classroom door, Principal Daniel Whitmore walked slowly down the corridor with his hands folded behind his back. He had paused earlier near the door while listening to Marcus speak, and the words had stirred a quiet reflection inside him. The memory of the morning at the gate returned to his thoughts again. The moment when he had first approached the scene. The moment when recognition had replaced assumption. Whitmore stopped briefly beside the large window at the end of the hallway and looked out over the school courtyard. Students crossed the open space below, their backpacks bouncing lightly as they moved toward their next classes. The principal took a slow breath, understanding that the lesson unfolding in Tyler's classroom was not only for the children sitting at those desks. It was also for the adults responsible for guiding them. Back inside the classroom, Marcus set the chalk down and faced the students again. One day, each of you will stand in places where you must decide how to treat the people you meet. When that moment comes, remember that every person deserves the chance to be understood before they are judged. The children sat quietly, listening with the kind of attention that often appears when a lesson touches something deeper than simple facts. And though none of them fully realized it yet, the story of a father standing patiently outside a school gate had already become one of the most important lessons they would carry from that classroom. The classroom remained quiet after Marcus Bennett finished his last sentence, the weight of his words settling gently into the room like the soft sunlight stretching across the wooden floor. The students were no longer whispering to one another the way they had earlier. Instead, many of them sat with their hands folded or their chins resting lightly on their palms, thinking carefully about the story that had begun outside the iron gate that morning. Tyler Bennett glanced around the classroom and noticed that several of his classmates were looking at his father with a new kind of respect. It was not the curiosity they had shown at the beginning of the presentation. It was something calmer, more thoughtful. Mr. Harper stepped forward beside the teacher's desk and smiled at the students. "I think Professor Bennett has given us something important to think about today," he said gently. "Sometimes the best lessons are not found in textbooks. They appear in the moments we live every day." Marcus nodded, slightly in agreement. The children were quiet again, but one small hand slowly lifted near the back of the room. A girl with dark braids looked uncertain as she spoke. "Professor Bennett, if someone makes a mistake about you before they know who you are, should they say they are sorry?" Marcus paused for a moment before answering, his eyes kind and patient. "Yes," he said softly. "When people realize they have made a mistake, an apology can be a powerful beginning. But understanding grows when we also choose to forgive and move forward." The girl nodded slowly, satisfied with the answer. Tyler watched his father closely, recognizing the same calm strength he had seen many times at home during long evenings when Marcus prepared his research notes or answered questions from students during online lectures. Across the room, another student raised his hand. "Did the person at the gate say sorry to you?" A few heads turned toward Marcus with curiosity again. Marcus smiled gently, though his answer remained careful. "This morning was not really about apologies," he said. "It was about learning. Sometimes people simply need the chance to see the whole story before they understand what happened." The classroom door opened quietly at that moment. Principal Daniel Whitmore stepped inside with a respectful nod toward Mr. Harper. The students turned in their chairs as he entered, surprised to see the principal visiting during their presentation. Whitmore walked a few steps into the room before stopping beside Marcus. His expression carried a thoughtful seriousness that immediately captured the students' attention. "Professor Bennett," he said clearly, "I hope I am not interrupting your lesson." Marcus shook his head politely. "Not at all. We were just discussing how understanding grows when people take time to listen." Whitmore nodded slowly, his eyes briefly moving toward the circle drawn on the chalkboard earlier. The words assumptions, understanding, and listening were still visible in white chalk. The principal took a quiet breath before speaking again. "Class, I would like to add something important to the conversation Professor Bennett has shared with you today. Earlier this morning, I was the person who first approached him outside the school gate." The room became even quieter as the students looked between Marcus and the principal. Whitmore continued calmly. "When I arrived, I realized that someone had been asked to wait outside because he had not yet been recognized. But the moment I looked closely, I remembered something very important. Several years ago, I attended a lecture where Professor Bennett spoke about fairness in education. His research has helped many schools across this country learn how to treat every student and every family with dignity. The The children listened carefully as the connection became clear. Tyler's face brightened with quiet pride. Whitmore looked back at Marcus with sincere respect. And today, he said gently, the lesson he shared with you did not begin in this classroom. It began right outside our own front gate. Marcus gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth of that moment. The students sat quietly, realizing that the story they had been hearing was not simply an example. It was something that had actually happened only a short time before they sat down at their desks. And in that realization, the lesson grew even more powerful, because the distance between theory and real life had suddenly disappeared. The classroom remained silent after Principal Daniel Whitmore finished speaking, the students absorbing the realization that the story they had been discussing was not simply an example from a book or a lecture. It had happened that very morning, just beyond the doors of their own school. Several children slowly turned their eyes toward Marcus Bennett with new understanding. Tyler Bennett sat a little straighter in his chair, the pride on his face impossible to hide. Marcus stood calmly beside the chalkboard, his hands resting loosely at his sides, allowing the moment to settle before speaking again. Sunlight from the tall windows warmed the room, and the faint sound of students moving through distant hallways reminded everyone that the school day continued outside their classroom. Principal Whitmore looked around at the students, then back at Marcus with sincere respect. "Class," he said gently, "when I first walked toward the gate this morning, I saw a situation that seemed ordinary. A father waiting outside, while the security officer followed the rules we have in place to protect our students. But sometimes even good rules can create moments where we must pause and think more carefully about what we are seeing." The children listened closely as the principal continued. "When I looked at Professor Bennett, something in my memory stirred. I remembered attending his lecture several years ago at a university conference about fairness in education. His words stayed with me long after that day. The lesson he shared with you today is the same lesson he shared with educators across the country. Understanding begins when we take time to learn who someone truly is." A quiet murmur moved gently through the classroom as the connection between the morning event and the lesson became clearer. Marcus stepped forward slightly and spoke with his usual calm tone. "Principal Whitmore is correct. What happened outside the gate was not meant to embarrass anyone. It was simply a moment where assumptions appeared before understanding. The important part is what happens after that moment." A boy near the center of the room raised his hand. What should happen after that moment? Marcus smiled warmly at the question. That is when people have the chance to grow. When we recognize a mistake, we learn from it. That is how communities become stronger. Tyler looked toward the principal and then back at his father. His voice carried a mixture of curiosity and courage as he asked his own question. "Dad, do you think the school will remember the lesson too?" The room grew even quieter after Tyler spoke. Principal Whitmore looked down briefly before answering. His voice was thoughtful and sincere. "Yes, Tyler, I believe we will. Every school should be willing to learn when a moment like this occurs." He then turned toward Marcus. "Professor Bennett, on behalf of Oak Ridge Academy, I would like to thank you not only for visiting our students today, but also for reminding us that fairness is something we must practice every single day." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Principal Whitmore. I believe schools are among the most important places where understanding can grow." The principal then looked back toward the students seated at their desks. "I hope each of you will remember what you heard today. The way we treat people matters, even in small moments that seem ordinary." The students nodded quietly, their attention fully focused. Tyler looked around the room at his classmates, feeling proud not only of his father, but also of the message that had filled their classroom. Marcus picked up the small piece of chalk once more and gently underlined the word listening on the board. "This word is simple," he said softly, "but it carries great power. When people listen, they learn. When they learn, they understand. And when understanding grows, fairness becomes possible." The children remained silent, knowing they had just experienced a lesson that would stay with them long after the bell rang. Outside the classroom window, the branches of the tall maple trees moved slowly in the breeze, and the school continued its ordinary rhythm. Yet inside that room, The morning had quietly transformed into something far more meaningful than a simple presentation day. The classroom remained still for several seconds after Marcus Bennett underlined the word listening on the chalkboard. The students looked at the board, then at Marcus, then slowly toward Principal Daniel Whitmore, as if each of them understood that the moment carried more meaning than a simple classroom presentation. Outside the windows, the wind moved gently through the maple trees that surrounded Oak Ridge Academy, scattering a few red leaves across the playground. The quiet movement of the branches seemed to mirror the calm reflection inside the room. Marcus set the chalk down carefully and stepped slightly away from the board. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to remain for a moment longer, giving the students time to think. Tyler Bennett watched his father with deep attention. He had seen this pause before during lectures that Marcus sometimes delivered at universities or community meetings. It was the moment when people began to understand something more deeply than words alone could explain. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice calm and steady. This morning could have been a moment of frustration, but instead it became a moment of learning. That is why I believe education matters so much. Education does not only happen in books or classrooms. Sometimes it happens in the small moments where we choose patience over anger. A girl near the front row nodded slowly as she listened. She looked down at her desk for a second and then raised her hand again. "Professor Bennett," she asked softly, "were you angry when you had to wait outside the gate?" Marcus looked at her with kindness before answering. "No, I was not angry. I have spent many years studying how people form assumptions. When you understand that process, you also learn that patience can open doors that frustration cannot." The students seemed to think carefully about that answer. Even Mr. Harper leaned slightly against his desk with quiet interest, recognizing that the lesson Marcus was offering reached far beyond the typical school presentation. Principal Whitmore took a small step forward and looked around the classroom once more. His voice carried a tone of humility that the students had rarely heard from an authority figure. "Professor Bennett," he said respectfully, "I would like to say something as well." Marcus nodded politely, inviting him to continue. Whitmore turned toward the students. "When I first approached the gate this morning, I saw a situation that appeared ordinary. A visitor waiting while our safety procedures were being followed. But in that moment, I also realized how easy it is for even well-meaning systems to overlook the full story of the people standing in front of us." He paused briefly before continuing. "That is why schools must remain places where we are always willing to learn and improve." Tyler looked from the principal back to his father, feeling a quiet sense of pride growing inside his chest. His classmates seemed to feel it as well. The story they had heard was no longer just about a misunderstanding. It had become a lesson about dignity. Marcus stepped forward again and rested one hand lightly on the edge of the teacher's desk. "Principal Whitmore, I appreciate your honesty. Moments like this become powerful when people are willing to reflect on them openly." The principal nodded with genuine respect. "Thank you, Professor Bennett. I believe our students are witnessing something important today." The children sat quietly, sensing that they were part of a conversation that adults rarely shared so honestly. Tyler finally raised his hand once more. "Dad," he asked gently, "what should someone do if they see another person being misunderstood like that?" Marcus smiled warmly at his son before answering. "The best thing you can do is offer understanding. Sometimes it means asking questions. Sometimes it means giving someone the benefit of patience. And sometimes it simply means remembering that every person deserves respect before they even speak." The students looked around the room, quietly absorbing the idea. Outside, the hallway bell rang softly in the distance, signaling the next part of the school day. Yet inside Tyler's classroom, the lesson still lingered, calm and powerful. In that moment, the students were not only learning about fairness in education. They were witnessing how dignity, patience, and understanding could transform an uncomfortable moment into a lesson that would remain with them for many years. The soft ringing of the hallway bell faded slowly beyond the classroom door, signaling that the next part of the school day was approaching. Yet inside Mr. Harper's classroom, no one moved immediately. The students remained seated in their semicircle, their attention still centered on Marcus Bennett and Principal Daniel Whitmore. The lesson that had begun outside the Iron Gate had quietly grown into something far deeper than a simple presentation. Marcus looked around the room one more time, his calm gaze resting briefly on each student as if he wanted to make sure the message had truly reached them. Tyler Bennett sat upright in his chair, his small hands resting on the desk, his eyes filled with pride and quiet understanding. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice steady and thoughtful. Before I leave today, I would like to share one final idea with all of you. The students leaned forward slightly, sensing that the moment carried importance. Marcus walked slowly toward the window, where sunlight filtered through the branches of the maple trees outside. When people study fairness in schools, they often focus on rules and policies. Those things are important, but fairness really begins with something much simpler. It begins with the way we choose to see one another. He turned back toward the classroom and continued. Every person who walks through a school door carries a story. A student, a teacher, a parent, even the visitors who arrive unexpectedly. When we take the time to listen to those stories, we build a community where everyone belongs. The students remained quiet, absorbing each word. Mr. Harper nodded slightly, recognizing how naturally Marcus had connected a complex idea to the everyday lives of the children in front of him. Principal Whitmore stood near the classroom door, his expression thoughtful as he reflected on the events of the morning. After a moment, he stepped forward again. "Professor Bennett," he said respectfully, "I believe our students will remember this lesson for a very long time." Marcus gave a small nod of appreciation. "I hope so, because one day these students will become the people who shape the schools, workplaces, and communities of the future." Tyler raised his hand again, his voice gentle but clear. "Dad," he asked, "do you think people can really change the way they see others?" Marcus looked at his son with warmth before answering. "Yes, Tyler. People can change when they are willing to learn. That is one of the most powerful things about education." The classroom remained still for a moment after that answer. Then Principal Whitmore turned toward the students once more. "I would like to say something as well before we continue the school day," he said. The children watched him with quiet attention. "Earlier this morning, I learned an important reminder myself. Even after many years working in education, there are always moments that challenge us to grow." He looked toward Marcus with sincere respect. "Professor Bennett, thank you for showing us that growth begins with humility and understanding." Marcus responded with a calm smile. "Thank you for being willing to learn from the moment." The principal then addressed the students again. "Class, remember what you have heard today. The way we treat people matters. The way we listen matters. And the way we choose to understand one another shapes the kind of community we create together." Several students nodded thoughtfully. Tyler glanced around at his classmates and realized that the story of the morning had become something they would talk about long after the bell rang. Marcus walked back toward the chalkboard and looked once more at the word he had underlined earlier. Listening. He gently tapped the chalkboard with his finger. "This word may seem small," he said softly, "but it holds the power to change how we see the world." Outside the window, the branches of the maple trees continued to move in the light breeze, and the quiet rhythm of the school carried on. Yet inside that classroom, something meaningful had taken place. A simple morning misunderstanding had become a lesson about dignity, patience, and the courage to see people for who they truly are. The quiet in Mr. Harper's classroom slowly softened as the morning lesson came to its natural end. Outside the tall windows, the school day continued with its usual rhythm. Students crossed the courtyard carrying books. Teachers guided small groups down the hallways. The world of Oak Ridge Academy moved forward the way it always did, yet something meaningful had quietly changed inside that one classroom. Marcus Bennett stepped away from the chalkboard and looked around the room one last time. The students were no longer simply curious about Tyler's father. They were thoughtful, reflective. Even the youngest among them seemed to understand that they had just witnessed something real. Mr. Harper clapped his hands gently to signal that the presentation had concluded. "Class, let's thank Professor Bennett for sharing his time and wisdom with us today." The students responded with warm applause that filled the small room with genuine appreciation. Tyler's face glowed with pride as he looked up at his father. Marcus nodded humbly to the children and then rested a gentle hand on Tyler's shoulder. "Thank you for listening so carefully today," he said. "Remember that every person you meet deserves to be understood before they are judged." The students nodded as if they were carrying those words somewhere deeper than a simple classroom memory. Principal Daniel Whitmore stepped forward again, standing beside Marcus. "Professor Bennett," he said sincerely, "I believe this school has learned an important lesson today." Marcus looked at him calmly. "Schools are living communities, Principal Whitmore. When a community is willing to learn from its moments, it becomes stronger." Whitmore nodded slowly. "Earlier this morning, I saw a man waiting outside the gate. I thought I was walking toward a simple situation. Instead, I found a reminder about the responsibility we carry as educators." He paused briefly before continuing. "Beginning tomorrow, Oak Ridge Academy will review how we welcome every family who arrives here. We will make sure that respect is the first thing people experience when they walk through our doors." Several students smiled quietly as they heard the principal speak. Tyler looked from Whitmore back to his father. "Dad," he said softly, "I think your lesson worked." Marcus smiled gently. Sometimes lessons grow in ways we cannot see right away. The bell rang softly in the hallway, signaling the next class period. Students began gathering their notebooks and backpacks, though many paused before leaving to thank Marcus personally. One girl said quietly, "I will remember what you said about listening." A boy near the door added, "I will try to ask people's names first." Marcus thanked each of them with warmth. Soon the classroom slowly emptied until only Marcus, Tyler, Mr. Harper, and Principal Whitmore remained. The room felt peaceful now, the morning sunlight still warming the wooden floor where a few cinnamon crumbs remained from the shared pastries. Tyler walked beside his father toward the door. As they stepped into the hallway, he looked up and asked one final question. "Dad, do you think today really made a difference?" Marcus glanced down at his son and smiled with quiet confidence. "Yes, Tyler, because one heart that learns to see others clearly can change an entire community." They walked together down the long corridor toward the front entrance. When the doors opened, the bright autumn light filled the hallway once more. The same iron gate stood outside where the morning story had begun, but now it felt like something different, not a barrier, simply a doorway. Marcus placed a hand gently on Tyler's shoulder as they stepped into the sunlight. And as father and son walked forward together, the lesson of that morning continued quietly in every mind that had heard it. Because respect does not begin with titles or appearances. It begins with the simple decision to see the humanity in the person standing in front of you.